Excellent. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to ADHD Unmasked, which the title today is doing a bit of double duty, really, because today we are talking about masking itself. ADHD and masking, and we've spoken about some posts and everything. The exhaustion of being seen for someone that you're not. So, just to start, for those who don't know me, I'm Phil Gros. I'm a ADHD coach and consultant. I spent 25 years in tech before what I do now, and now it's about working towards a more neuro-inclusive world. But I want to be upfront right from the start. I mask too. This isn't me standing on the outside going, I don't mask, or I kind of don't. I used to mask, and I don't now. I still mask, as I think a lot of us do, and that's part of the. You kind of get diagnosed. You kind of realize that you can start seeing some of the masking, but and some of the things I'm still trying to deal with is what's masking, what's me. After 40 odd years of doing it, it's kind of where are those lines if they exist at all. And with me, I've got Nishia.
Hi, and I'm Nishia. I run Your ADHD Life. I'm also an ADHD coach. I coach late diagnosed women. And like Phil, I've been masking my whole life. I just don't think I had the words for it until fairly recently. And so that's the tone that we set for today. We're not two experts up here lecturing at you. We're two people who actually do the thing, talking honestly about what it costs and what actually helps us. And like Phil, full transparency, I admit I have had some serious nerves about today. Of course, neither of us are ever as prepared as we would like to be. But for today, a panel about the exhaustion of performing, being totally fine or looking totally fine, is either really terrible or perfect timing. So Phil?
Yeah. So and just having a look, and I know we kind of looked at who people who signed up for it, and I know there's been a assessment that Nishia put together for us, kind of that people have been filling out. So I know there's a room of a real mix of people here today, which is great. I know some of you are here because you mask and you're exhausted by it. Some of you are here to support other people. We know there's a teacher here, there's a therapist. I know there's someone here supporting colleagues from work. So wherever you're coming from, you're in the right place. The cost of masking shows up the same way, whether it's yours or someone you care about. So just quickly looking ahead for the next 55 minutes. First of all, we're going to look at what masking actually is, then why it's kind of so exhausting for the ADHD brain specifically. And we'll look at the actual reason rather than it's just tiring. And I think this is a bit, I'm really interested in, I'd stay for, is that about half past, we'll get practical. So, what does unmasking actually look like? Step by step. And honestly, there's a lot of nonsense out there on TikTok and everything else. And, whilst we're definitely, don't say we're experts, hopefully that, some of those can be, a bit of information can be really, really helpful. So 2 quick things before we get going. I'm going to stick a poll on the screen now. So be interesting just to see what people are seeing. So when you get home after a normal day, how much is left in the tank at the moment? And to respond to it, you can just put a comment in the chat, just 1, 2, 3, or 4 to go with your answer, and that will kind of show up on our poll. Be really, really nice to see. And then I'll also put in a comment in there in the chat about the assessment that we just spoke about. We'll come back to it later. But if you've done the self-assessment, grab your score and keep it in mind. We'll come back to that. And if you haven't done it, the link's there. So it takes about 3 minutes. So maybe you can even do it while you're looking at this. Okay, so we'll kind of keep that going at the moment. But I think, Nishia, if you're ready, I think maybe we'll kind of kick off really and kind of look at the basics around what masking actually is.
Yeah, I thought before we start, Phil, how much is left in your tank at the end of I say the end, working from home
I mean,
for yourself.
how much is it, considering the conversation we had before we joined, how much is left in it at the moment? Yeah, I'm definitely going through a period at the moment where I'm getting exhausted at the moment. I must admit, I kind of go through my highs and lows of, everything's kind of ups and downs. And I'm going through a time at the moment where I am getting to the day and I'm really, really exhausted. And I know I don't probably rest enough, sleep enough, everything else, all the good things that, we know we need to do. But yeah, it's with ADHD, it often is the case. Our minds are so busy anyway. And people kind of think about physical, exhaustion, but the mental exhaustion when your brain is running at 1,000 miles an hour all the time is tiring. And when you add in things like masking, and you're watching what you're saying, who you're saying it with, kind of, and then other elements we've already spoken about in the past, RSD and everything else, you're burning cycles effectively, you're burning energy and all these other things, thinking 20 steps ahead about a project you're on. These are all extra bits that we're kind of using energy wise. And it can be difficult. What about you?
So something that kind of occurred to me while we were preparing for this over the last few days is masking from myself. Now, I'm just kind of talking through my thoughts, but I feel like not only do I mask around other people, but I feel like sometimes I mask from myself. It's like trying to hide my own, I suppose, ADHD idiosyncrasies from myself, which I don't know. Just I don't know if anyone else comment if that's something that sort of resonates with you, but that's been on my mind recently. So before we actually start, just so that you know why this topic and why now. So Phil and I started this series a couple months ago. We've talked about imposter syndrome, and we've talked about rejection sensitivity dysphoria, RSD. And this topic, masking, kind of sits beneath both of them. It's a thing that we've built for ourselves quietly over years, that so that no one can see the struggle that we feel and that we face on the inside. And today we're going to try to pull all that apart, talk about what it is, what it's quietly costing you, and what you can actually do about it. So let's start with the basics. What is masking actually? So masking is in the simplest way, it's putting on a brave face for years and running a whole load of hidden systems and so scaffolding is what I call it, just to look like you're coping. So for me, it was building systems of scaffolding in secret just to appear marginally functional, is the kind of phrase that I like to use for myself, scaffolding in secret. And so what does that mean by scaffolding, all this invisible stuff? It's the lists, it's the lists of lists. It's the double and triple checking everything before I send it or I finalize it. It's rehearsing a phone call, what I'm going to say before I actually make it. And on a kind of side note, I feel like AI these days helps, but also doesn't help. Maybe something that we can pick up on later. And it's almost perfectionism at its height, all because we're trying to hide our perceived inadequacies from everyone else. And what I mentioned earlier is, I think, even from ourselves. And all this is like hiding everything from everyone on the outside. It looks like we're calm, we're super organized, we're on top of things, and yet inside it's absolute chaos. And I'm working twice, 3 times, 4 times as hard, at least this is how it feels, as everyone else, just to keep this kind of cool, calm, and collected version of me going. And the thing that got me was when I started kind of learning about what masking is how automatic it is. You totally even forget you're doing it. I kept discovering things that I thought were just my personality or my character, and this is just how I am, when actually these are super elaborate ways that I've been masking for years without even noticing. And it's just quite a strange thing to realize about yourself. Like Phil was saying, what is me and what is the masking? And here's the kind of stat. We're not here to throw numbers at everyone, research papers and stuff, but there are a couple things I think are worth talking about. And that's 92% of adults with ADHD mask. That's practically everyone. Okay. So masking isn't this unusual thing here. It's nearly everyone, all of us does it. And that's not even to say that people who are not ADHD don't. They do as well. It's just far more extreme for people with ADHD, which means that the interesting question was never do you mask? It's what is that masking costing you? And so just hold on to that thought, because that's really what today is going to be about. And one useful distinction before I hand over back to Phil, there's a difference between compensation and suppression. Now I had to kind of think a couple times about how to phrase this. I'm just going to repeat that. There's a difference between compensation and suppression. Compensation is the helpful stuff, the tools, the planning, the systems that kind of generally get you through your day. That's fine. That's regular, quite expected. Suppression is the other thing, the pretending, the hiding, the erasing parts of yourself to fit in to kind of everything that is life around us. And that's the part that does the real damage. So when we talk about masking today, it's really going to be about that second thing, that pretending that we actually mean. And Phil, I imagine you see a lot of this with your clients in the workplace.
Yeah, and we do. But actually, one point, and I put it up on the chat here because I think it's probably worth picking up. I don't know if you can see that, Nishia, on the screen, a message from Anna about internal masking and whether that's kind of almost gaslighting yourself when you're kind of thinking like that. What would you kind of say to that, I guess, when you're kind of looking at the way you're talking about it?
So that's kind of, I suppose that's kind of exactly what I talked about. Kind of exactly, what kind of English is that? That is what I was talking about. It's like it is gaslighting yourself. And I mean, I can kind of stand back from that comment for a minute, because it is something that I've been thinking about the last few days. And we'll come back to sort of how we unpick this, but that's a really fair comment, actually, a good comparison.
I think it's an interesting one, and it's easy to kind of, a lot of these things are kind of, how we feel. I talk about this a lot with my clients, whether it's kind of emotional regulation or anything else, the fact that you kind of think it is a validation, of that it's happening. But I guess it's understanding what that's masking is, and we can't always see the masking. And it kind of goes, I think it goes back to that kind of, for me, I don't know where my masking stops, or what is masking and what isn't. And it's one of the real kind of questions I've had about myself in the couple of years since I got diagnosed. It's almost, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this. This isn't kind of a identity crisis. But when I do kind of sit down, I think it's more interesting than anything else. I don't really understand it. Is what is me? What is masking? Is it masking? Is that my personality? Where does personality? And we're all forgetting masking, ADHD, neurodiversity. Everything is. We're all everyone's made up of their experiences of life, and that's what kind of makes people's who they are, and the experiences and the personalities and their outlook. And part of our masking is because of our experiences, but then what's kind of additional, and I think it's really, really interesting. I think some of it's sometimes just being able to think about it, being aware about it, is one of the biggest things that we can do. But going back to what you asked me just before, though, Nishia, and I know I'm conscious we've definitely overran in the past on time, so I want to make sure we stick to it a bit better today. But yeah, we're definitely within the workplace. We can see it a lot, and I think one of the things I've found surprises people a lot is that usually it's the most high functioning looking person on the team can be carrying the heaviest version of the masking. And I've definitely seen that with a couple of clients of mine. And high performance and heavy masking aren't opposite. They're not one or the other. They're very often the same person. It's the person who builds all those elaborate private systems. So their team, the manager, only ever sees reliability. They're not looking. No one else can see the effort underneath that. It's quietly hiding those days when your focus is gone. Writing little scripts before meetings so that nobody clocks that you've lost a thread. Pulling these things out of the back pocket. And it's basically a second job. That's going alongside it. And you don't get any recognition or thanks for that effort because no one sees it. No one knows it's there. And definitely I've done that, during my time, in corporate life, the preparation, and that full system behind it the night before that no one was seeing, or, my late nights to try and do stuff that was always the last minute because I got my adrenaline. The adrenaline was replacing the dopamine from it, the fear of missing my deadline. And, it's I've thought of another example of it. It's gone straight out of my head. But, from the outside, you're seen as being reliable. But from the inside, there's a whole second thing happening there. And, if you lead people, it's almost doubly loaded because you're trying to perform competence to, in two directions at once. You to the people you manage, you're leading, then to your team, you're doing it, but also then up to your management chain, to your boss, so your masking never gets a break. You never get a point where you can just sit back and kind of almost be yourself. But yeah, is there anything else that kind of, you can think of?
I think that's really the point. That's the cost. All that scaffolding that you build around you, all the hidden work that you do, the extra stuff that no one sees. It's not free. That's the part that nobody sees from the outside. So let's talk about maybe why. Why is it so exhausting for our ADHD brains?
Yeah, and I think maybe before we get into the why, let's look at that poll from the start of the hour. Because there's most of you told us there's almost nothing left in the tank at the end of a normal day. And that's a normal day. It's not a hard day. We always have the hard days that take everything out, but a normal one. And I think that's something we need to hold on to, because what we're about to explain is the why, and that's not a coincidence. And it's the why is not a personal failing either. It's goes back to the thing I keep coming back to all the time. We're not broken. There's nothing to be fixed or hacked. it's just us. We need to just understand. It's about us understanding our user manual, you know, and which I always kind of come back to. I probably use that analogy far too much, but and for those of you who did the self-assessment, you know, we sent around, or if you've done it, you know, today, you know, from the results we've seen come in, you know, nearly all of you have scored mid or high on the cost of masking. You know, so this isn't some abstract theory. You know, it's backed up by, you know, your own numbers. You know, and that's why it's kind of, I guess it's so important, really. And if we look at the science, then, you know, and I'm not one ever going into the kind of the numbers and everything, but some of it I think is useful just explaining it. You know, our ADHD brains, you know, already run short on what's called the executive function system. So, you know, that's your attention, working memory, ability to hold back on impulse, staying with a thread, emotional regulation, you know, and that's well understood, well established. You know, it's, you know, they reckon our brains are 30% less developed for executive functions. That's not to be confused with intelligence, completely separate. You're extremely intelligent, executive function is completely separate. Yeah, and that's just how the ADHD brain works. Which means you start every single day with fewer of those resources, you know, than a neurotypical person has on tap. So before you've even done anything, before you've even masked at all, that's where you're starting from. And then add masking on top of that, that second job I was talking about, you know, because it isn't a thing you do at once and it's done, it's continuous. It's that second task running in the background all the time. You know, you're reading the room, monitoring your own face, checking your tone. For me, amount of times I'll be kind of talking to someone, I'm like, which eye am I looking at? I'm looking at one eye, look at eye. Oh, I'm looking at the nose. By which point I've forgotten even what they're saying. I've concentrated on that. I've completely gone off and, you know, done anything else. You know, editing what we're going to say. Yeah, and it's all done in real time. You know, so rehearsing that thing you're going to say in the meeting while pretending to listen to the thing that's being said now. I've definitely done that an awful lot. You know, it never switches off when you're around other people. You know, whether it's in the meeting, at the school gate, on the phone, it's always going. And so, you know, picture it, you've got a brain that's already short on executive resource, and then you're asking it to run this constant extra monitoring job at the same time, you know, all day, every day, on top of, you know, your day job. Which means, you know, if you take one thing from today, take this, and that's an ADHD brain pays more to run the exact same mask. So that same calm exterior, the same I'm fine, the same reliable person in the meeting, it costs us more to produce than it costs anyone else. And that's why we become so tired. You know, that's why there's nothing left in the tank. You know, the exhaustion is real load. It's, yeah, we're not running a marathon physically, but mentally we are. And, you know, that's not weakness. It's not you being dramatic. It's certainly not you failing to try hard enough. You know, you're doing more work than the people around you can see, you know, and that, yeah, full stop. That's it.
Putting that into like a feeling, because that's kind of the bit that we know from the inside. The way that I like to describe it is, it's like I'm sitting in one of these office chairs that swivels around, and I'm surrounded by a circle of TVs. All these TVs are playing different channels, all at different volumes, and somebody else has got the remote control and keeps changing the channels, and I can't make it stop. That's what ADHD feels like for me. All this, what Phil was talking about, this marathon that we're running in our head, and the medication, the meds for me are like someone giving me the remote control. I can turn the volume down on all the TVs whenever I want. I can change the channels, but The thing that's missing is that remote doesn't come with a TV guide, so to say. So it doesn't tell me what to watch at what time, and it doesn't hand me. So what does that mean? That means it doesn't hand me those executive function skills that I just don't have, which is why this whole just take the medication was never the whole answer. And for many people, myself included, I'm sure Phil will agree with me here, going into that whole titration and medication process, I thought that was going to be this magic pill that's going to fix everything for me, and I'm going to come out the other end, and all of a sudden everything is just going to be perfect. Of course, we know that's not the case. And the place that all of this shows up most brutally in terms of the cost of masking is at home, I think, because you spend it all day at work, whether that is work in the workplace, work if you're working from home, or work in terms of looking after the house, looking after the kids, looking after yourself. When it comes to the masking, at the end of the day, there's nothing left for the people that you love. And there's this line that I heard that kind of struck me. The better the mask, the bigger the bill. And that's really something that I've been thinking about quite a lot the last couple of days. We get so good at looking fine to everyone else around us, but we pay for it in private on the couch at the end of the day when there's absolutely nothing left for you to give.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of looking at it, actually. And there's one thing as well I saw put up was I feel that masking is fueling imposter syndrome, if anything, more than gaslighting. But that imposter syndrome, definitely, that masking can kind of end up reinforcing. You can definitely feel that you're masking inadequacies or failures in what you're doing, which 100% then can go into imposter syndrome. So we often see those kind of see them together. And I think,
and the RSD as well.
And that's why imposter syndrome is we know, it's not just a ADHD thing, not just for the neurodiverse community. It's generally there, but we see it so often within kind of the neurodiverse community because of the masking of the, and the RSD and everything else that comes with it. And, so that's kind of, I guess that's the cost. I'm aware we're coming to Harpos now, so we're going to want to make sure we kind of keep moving on, but it's, it's real, it's measurable, and it's not your character, it's your workload, and that leads, I guess, to the obvious question, and it's the one we did promise you is, if the mask costs this much, how do we put it down? And it's, without kind of jumping ahead, it is more complicated than just be yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Nishia, do you want to kind of,
Well,
so where do you want to start on? Where do you want to start on that?
Well, that's the advice that everyone gives you, right? Just be yourself.
Yeah.
Why can't you just let loose? And it's really the wrong place to start. I actually, I did an interview with someone, I don't know, quite a few weeks ago, and it was the first time I met her, and she just, to me at least, she just looked like she just did not care about what anyone else said or thought about who she was. To me, it felt like she was totally herself around me. And after the time that we spent together, I kind of went back and had to think about it. And actually, it's because the kind of crowd that we were in, the 3 or 4 people that we were together with during that day, we were all neurodivergent. And So that's kind of this whole finding your tribe. Because when you've masked your entire life, and Phil and I have both noticed this, you generally don't know who be yourself is. Who is yourself? It feels like someone described it to me as if you're method acting your way through your entire life. And like someone has just handed you a script and said, right here is the script, just kind of be yourself now. And you're standing, you're thinking, well, I don't even know who be yourself is. I don't know who that is. And so before we give you anything practical, let's sort of talk about the emotional bit, because that's what's real. And when you take your mask off, relief and grief show up together at the same time. So it's the relief that you finally feel like you understand yourself. And then the grief, real grief, for all those years that you spent trying to be someone else without knowing or without realizing that you were trying to be someone else, and for what that cost you. And both of these are normal. They sit side by side. We're not doing anything wrong if it's painful, as well as freeing. It kind of goes. They both go hand in hand. And being kind of honest with everyone, because overstating this would be a complete lie. And honesty is kind of the whole thing, really. If you go home tonight and Google how to unmask with ADHD, you're going to find 10-step plans everywhere. Confident, tidy, neat, numbered lists. And what I think we would like you all to know, almost all of this is borrowed from autism research. And none of it is actually validated, or very little of it is actually validated for ADHD. There is no proven unmasking program for ADHD. And we're not going to stand here and sell you something, okay? The honest version is smaller than what the internet out there makes it out to be. But the good news is, because it's smaller, it's actually doable. So here's the kind of honest version from Phil and Nishia. The 5 steps. Let's start with the first one, okay? And that's notice. Notice first, and don't change anything. So for a week, all you do is just notice. Notice where the mask goes on. When does it turn on? Is it at work? Is it at the school gates? Is it the second you walk into your mom's kitchen? Or the second your mom walks into your kitchen? Is this
getting into real personal kind of personal experiences, Nishia?
My mom is visiting me, which is why.
Is she watching? She's watching.
She's probably listening from behind the door. We're not fixing anything yet here. We're just kind of observing. Okay. And that's the first step. That can take you a whole week, if not 2. And that's the sort of reflective audit that we're going to email to everyone at the end of this session later this evening. That's exactly what that's all about. It's about noticing and walking through it with you. And then the second step is pick one safe kind of low stakes space. Not everywhere. Don't try and unmask everywhere. Just one person or one place where being seen as yourself costs the least. Don't try this at work. Don't try this at your big Sunday family lunch or dinner. Somewhere gentle. It's a place to start there. So, for example, when I'm talking to Phil, I can just be myself, because I know we're both on the same sort of same level. Yeah, on the same page. And then I guess the third thing is to just drop one thing. Don't drop your entire mask. This is quite important. Keep all your scaffolding, compensation, keep the lists, the planning, the systems, all the helpful stuff. That's not the problem. Those aren't the things to throw out. It's just kind of releasing one piece of the pretending. And some days you won't. And some days the mask is what you absolutely need to get you through the day. And that's totally fine. Masking selectively is absolutely fine. This isn't about a sort of all or nothing approach. Phil, is there anything else that you want to pick up on?
Yeah, so I think, and I think something I made a note of it because my normal way I'd forget otherwise to pick it up. But what you're saying about there's no big changes, I think is one of the big things. It's a compounding effect. I mean, it's not ripping a plaster off. And exactly like you've said is what I say to people as well, is the first stage is awareness. It's just catching it. It's just seeing when it's happened, whether it's in the moment, which is great, you get to that point, but initially it's just seeing it in the past. Just if you aren't noticing it, if you can't catch it, then you're not going to be able to change anything. You might not want to change anything, some bits you just don't want to change either. We're talking about masking and how to drop the mask. You don't need to. There is overhead and energy that goes into it, but there's comfort as well. And it's not for us or anyone else to say you need to drop a mask. It's about what's right for you. But the first stage is to understand what's happening, And I think, almost going back to what we were saying before about exhaustion as well, is I actually think post-diagnosis and then being aware of the masking note, actually, if anything, becomes more exhausting.
Yeah.
And these are a lot of people, and I definitely have it, where I felt even more exhausted really than I did before. That's because I'm now aware of it and I'm seeing it, and then I'm trying to, and that kind of brings its own overhead. That's not to say not to do it, but it's showing there's a difference. And once you're aware of it, then we can look at the things that we want to change, if anything at all. And I think, in a lot of my clients kind of in the corporate life or leaders and businesses, and in work, masking can take a slightly different form, but it's 100% there. And first off, you don't go back to what we were saying about unmasking. You don't have to unmask at work, and definitely not first. And then I usually say don't start from there. Work is not the place necessarily to start on that. And a lot of people, definitely stats, and I can pull them up and stuff. I'm not going to because it's not about that. But there's a lot of people, who are masking at work and neurodivergent, and it's something, we'll bring this one. It's something like 95, 96% in some survey I saw somewhere of UK adults with ADHD were reluctant to, even raise it with the employer, that they've got it. So, if you're weighing up that decision, it feels heavy. You're not alone, and it's not cowardice. There's a rational calculation there, and most people are making the same one. But you don't need, and I think this is something that people really need to realize, you don't need a formal diagnosis to ask for reasonable adjustments. So therefore, by definition, you don't need to kind of make a big thing about how, you're ADHD. If you don't want to, you don't need to talk about it. The reasonable adjustments at work is needs led, not paperwork led, not kind of a bit of form saying that, you need support. So you can change your environment, and I know it's different for everyone. So I'm not going to say it's easy for everyone, and different jobs are different, harder to do than others, but change your environment, how you work, what you're asked to do, how information comes to you. And you can kind of request that without making big declarations. And as I say, I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying that all employers support people as we hope they would. But I would say that's the kind of the first stop is, looking at the environment first, ground announcements or opening up to management and stuff, that's optional. And honestly, not even necessary at all, depending on where you are. And so, just to clarify, when I'm talking about adjustments, it doesn't need to be anything dramatic. It might be asking for meeting agendas to be shared in advance, so you're not processing stuff cold. It's having written follow-ups rather than relying on what you heard. Is it being able to have a camera off without a fuss being made? Is it, you've got AI and stuff now and Copilot and everything else within organizations? Is it being able to have, so there's written follow-ups, having it that meetings are transcribed and by default, and minutes are made or points are taken, rather than people going, I don't want it to be recorded. These are all things you can ask about, and see, are they things that can change, little changes. And a lot of those things, this goes back to why it's kind of reasonable adjustments isn't about a bit of paper, it's about needs, is that a lot of the reasonable adjustments help everyone. It isn't just for people who are neurodivergent or other conditions that you need some additional support. It kind of helps everyone. So as a manager, I'll love to talk to a leader and stuff and say, whether it's for them or kind of, talk to leaders as well. We've got neurodivergent team members, and it's not about making it for one person. Let's find out how the whole team like to work, so it's whether it's kind of the parent who needs to pick up for school, needs a flexibility for childcare, or, whatever. There's a whole lot of them, obviously, and my mind's just gone blank completely. But, all these different scenarios and dynamics are at play. So going in and asking for those small adjustments, I think, is probably one of the biggest things we can do first before having to go, okay, I'm going to drop this mask.
And I think one point before we kind of go on to the fourth step is some of these reasonable adjustments, if we're talking about gently removing your mask, doesn't actually have to even start with asking for reasonable adjustments. It could be, like Phil said, talking about having meeting agendas in advance, or having clearer instructions. Those are some of the things that, let's face it, they stress us out. Okay. And this is where the kind of start of the overcompensation comes in. Just kind of go back to people and ask, what exactly is it that we're going to be talking about? I just want to be clear. Or clarifying instructions. It can start with something really simple like that, and trying not to worry too much about what other people are going to think about you asking. So it doesn't have to start by being reasonable, classified as a sort of reasonable adjustment. So if we go back to kind of our next step, is expecting that relief and grief together. Like we said before, it's the first time you let that mask slip, or part of that little mask slip, and nothing bad happens. There's this kind of rush of relief. Oh my goodness, thank God for that. And then sometimes you get the grief that sits behind it. Let that both sit there. It's absolutely fine. Just be kind of curious about it, notice it. And instead of being hard on yourself, using curiosity, it's a really good antidote to the shame. And then fifth, change the environment before you change yourself. So try and change things around you before changing yourself. Sometimes the mask, the answer isn't like unmask harder. It's just finding or building a room that doesn't demand so much masking in the first place. This whole find your tribe kind of thing. Going into the adjustments, reasonable adjustments that Phil was talking about. Those adjustments are different for different people. So I think, what should we move on?
Yeah, I know we've got some quick questions and answers. So if anyone wants to put any comments in for questions and answers, we want to make sure we've got some space for that. But just kind of, I've been looking at the comments. I've been kind of putting a few up as we go along, and unfortunately, a lot of it isn't surprising me that that people aren't necessarily having good experiences from unmasking within the workplace, and definitely there is a very mixed bag out there in terms of organizations and individual managers, leaders and team members who don't support in the way that we would hope. And I can't pretend otherwise. I'm not going to go and go, yeah, it's all great and it's brilliant. I know that the leaders I work with, the organisations I work with, I'm quite lucky that they can see the benefit and they want to embrace it. But I know that's definitely not necessarily everywhere, and I don't even know if you can even say it's a normal otherwise. And so I think it goes back to we live in the world we live in rather than the world we want, and that's why unmasking. Go back to say at the beginning of the bit when I was talking about work. Work is definitely, I would never say work's usually the place to start unmasking, and whilst I'm not going to say anyone needs to mask or should mask, I'm also not going to say that you should remove it. It's not that black and white, and it's down to everyone's experiences. But maybe even being able to do something at home with close family, even to family members, partners, we all kind of still mask as well, especially before we even realize we're even doing it. If we can reduce masking elsewhere, that's taking some of the pressure, some of the energy, depletion away. Maybe that helps us more at work. It kind of feels really unsatisfactory saying that. But it's, if you're in a position where you are lucky enough to have an understanding workplace, or I'm saying manager, and I say it doesn't need to be going in with a whole list of things and turning it into a big thing, just a smaller thing, or even doing it that's not anything to do with I've had clients who have asked for adjustments, but they don't really want to go in with I've got ADHD and everything for whatever reason, but it's about kind of doing the one-to-ones and stuff. Is like let's understand how we work best, each of us. How does my manager like to have things to be done? How do I work best? And starting that conversation. It's got nothing to do with whether you've got ADHD or autism or any other kind of ways of working that the reasons for the way you want to work. And so sometimes it's even just taking that out the conversation, but just looking at purely what it is that could help. And do as a two-way thing. How does my manager like things to be done? How do they like stuff to be presented to them or handed down? How do I do it? How do we kind of find that common ground? I don't know if that kind of helps or if that even makes sense, but so I don't know if we got any questions on there. So while I've been talking, I'm able to kind of look at the messages at the same time. But thank you, for everyone who has been putting stuff. I've seen a lot of stuff coming up in the messages. I know there's kind of conversations going back and forth, and I know we often get it on here, kind of different views and opinions and stuff, and that's great as well. It's about a discussion, so it's not like everyone needs to be, everyone in the same viewpoint. A lot of this is our own experiences and what we feel and what we've had. And that definitely shapes where we're coming from.
So Phil, I've actually got a question, which I think it's kind of difficult to, as you said, concentrate on what we're talking about and have a look at the comments at the same time. But something that I thought people may be thinking about is if you're a leader or a team manager, and you have neurodivergence, because obviously masking, this is something that's very common with ADHD and autism and if you're here in that kind of role, and what can you take away from the session? How can you help to support people in your team who with their masking?
So I think there's two things. I'll keep it very short because on time, but I think there's two things I try to work with leaders and with organizations on, which is one is almost like a knowledge thing of being aware. It's not someone's, it's kind of like the other side of the same coin of of people aren't broken. It's just how that, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just a neurological wiring. That's how it is. There's nothing broken, or it's not because someone's lazy or doesn't want to do something. It's not a conscious kind of decision that's kind of happening. And so the first thing is that as leaders or people to kind of understand that it's not something that anyone's controlling. It's not that they're wanting to work in a specific way. It's a need, in the same way that the leader's got a need about, if we're talking about the kind of the way people work, how they work. And we're in a society that's more neurotypical than otherwise, so a lot of the ways we work are kind of based around that. So what gets seen as being the obvious way of working isn't necessarily right for everyone. And in fact, I had a conversation with a client yesterday, and he actually really seems right now we're talking there about what felt easy for them. They kind of changed the way they're working, and suddenly everything's feeling easier, and it's almost like they're not working hard enough now because they're not having those struggles. And it's just like, but that's just because it's easy, that means it's working the way you want it to. Before you weren't. And it's about understanding with a leader that's those little changes. It's not necessarily a big change. So it's kind of understanding that can be the reasoning behind it, and everything, so that they feel they want to make a change and they understand why it is. And a lot of people do, to be fair. There's a lot of people want to lead well, they want to do it, but sometimes they're either just not aware the best way to, or they're oblivious to certain facts. And especially the former one of they're not sure what to do, is they have really good intentions, but it isn't necessarily what the person needs. I've definitely gone into organizations. It's like, oh, okay, you've got ADHD, or here's some noise cancelling headphones. Here's, here's a notepad. And that might be great. That might be exactly what they need, but you have no idea. And in fact, and as a newly diagnosed person, you might yourself not have any idea, because I definitely didn't. When you're newly diagnosed, it's like, I don't really know. I'm learning as I go along, kind of all of this. So it really is more, it sounds really basic, but is the communication. Having those, being able to be approachable, have a conversation with your employee, as leader, of how they're feeling, where are they struggling, maybe even taking out the whole what's ADHD, what's not. Just, you should be doing this anyway as a good leader, but what's struggling, what is used for you, how, where are your friction points. And then that doesn't mean we can remove everything either. Reasonable adjustments isn't everything can go how we want it, as lovely as that be, but we've got to work in an environment where it's balanced for everyone as well. But it is about understanding. And if you haven't got that understanding, if you're not having those conversations, how do you know what the right thing is? Because every ADHD is different, every autism person is different, the autistic person is different. So that's within our community, we understand that. So everyone's going to be different when you talk to them. So I think that's the biggest thing I kind of people take away.
And I think just before we kind of come to an end, that sort of comes back to the purpose of the audit that we're going to be sending to everyone. So you talked about, as someone who's, or maybe not newly diagnosed, not entirely understanding what it is that you need to help yourself, to start to unmask, to lift that heavy load off. That audit that we will send out will help to I guess help to make you think a little bit and consider a little bit about when you mask, how it affects you, and then what you can do slowly, take little steps, what little steps you can take to start to unmask. So should we look at that poll?
Yeah, so just sort of you've been talking there, I'll just kind of put a poll up just to kind of finish. So, after today, what's your next step with your masking? And 1 to 4, if you put it in the chat, then that'll kind of automatically come up on there. And while that's happening, I saw a message just before that did pop up as well, as someone said about how do we see any of the old sessions that we've run, specifically one around RSD. It's a good point, actually. The quickest way I'd probably say to do it is, because you'll be in LinkedIn, if you go onto my page or Nishia's, you'll be able to look through our past posts, and there'll be a link to the RSD webinar. And so you follow that link, it shows the recording, same as the link you followed today. If you follow that after the session, you automatically get the recording. So yeah, if you have a look at either of our profiles, you'll be able to find a post regarding the RSD. But it's a good point, actually. We should actually have a look at how we can easily make those available.
Maybe like how I posted the link to the audit in the comments. I can post the link to the other two, the RSD and the imposter syndrome.
Yeah, we'll put that in the chat after this. That's a good idea, definitely. Yeah. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, just have a look on our profiles. You'll be able to find them. So so yeah, it'd be interesting to see what everyone is doing. I think there's only one at the moment, but that's fine. Maybe people kind of still kind of thinking about it, but it'll be good to something maybe for you to take away and think about, with the masking. And there isn't a right or wrong answer to any of this. And as I've been able to keep up with some of the chat that's been happening. The world isn't how we want it, so it's not as easy as just saying, yeah, we should be able to unmask and everything will be great. The main thing is that you're protecting yourself, you're looking after yourselves, but making those changes where you can. And as I say, sometimes is just making it at home in a safe environment, and that the load that takes off you is enough to kind of help everywhere else, And so finding somewhere safe is really important. And I guess actually that's something next week. We haven't got the link, I think, but we will be sharing it, and we'll share it in the chat after the session, and we'll put a post up and maybe an email out about a clinic we'll do next week. Small, it's on Zoom, so people, it's not recorded, there's no replay, but come on, and we'll just talk to us, about anything that you're thinking about. Any of the questions you had today, jump on the call. More than welcome. We'll put a link out for that. But it'd be great to see you. Or if you want, even just join. You don't need to share anything if you don't want to. You can just be part of the conversation, a bit like today. So,
and one thing to take away, Phil?
Yeah. One to take away.
What would you suggest?
Well, no, I think it's to sum everything up. It would be. It's not about whether you mask or how much you mask or where you mask. It's what it costs, and that cost is real load. That's real kind of energy that's been taken away. And that's not a character flaw. That's just how things, how we're wired in that. So I guess that's a reframe that I'd like everyone to kind of think about. It's not whether you mask, it's what does it cost.
And I think for me, I hope a little bit of homework, I guess, an experiment for the week is I hope that everyone takes a bit of time to just notice where you mask. That's all. Don't change anything, and just be gentle with yourself to start with. And later tomorrow, we'll send everyone an email with the short reflective audit that will help you walk through exactly how to do that in a gentle step-by-step way, so that you can start from sitting on your couch with a cup of tea, and you don't have to think about trying to fix everything or anything, just noticing. And one last thing before we let you go, when we asked everyone about what you'd like to get back if you masked less, nobody talked about promotions. Nobody talked about wanting to improve their productivity. Nobody talked about they wanted more money or anything like that. Everyone's wish was peace and a bit of calm and less stress, I guess, over and over. And that's exactly what all of this is about. That's what's on the other side of this step-by-step process. And it's absolutely worth it. And it's also something I think that doesn't end. Like Phil said, even after being diagnosed after years, it's something that I definitely come back to over and over again, and just remind myself of every once in a while. You just need to sit back and just take notice.
Excellent. That's a great way to finish off. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Tell everyone about our next event next month.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I was just going to finish up and wrap up. So just say, yeah, next month we're going to be talking about people pleasing and boundaries, which, as you probably already know, it's kind of like masking, but it's wearing a different outfit. So it's kind of like the social version of masking. So we'll send out a registration link for that soon. So please keep an eye out for that. As I said before, today's recording, follow the link for this session. It'll be there on LinkedIn. We'll also put it up on YouTube as well, so you can rewatch or share it out to anyone that you think it'd be useful for. And yeah, do the self-assessment if you haven't. The link's in the chat, and hopefully we'll see you next week at the clinic. But yeah, I think thank you very much. Be kind to yourselves, and yes, goodbye from me, and
bye from me. Thanks.
See you later. Bye-bye.